Are you worthy to be my master?
The legend of King Arthur is a timeless story extending far beyond anime.
King Arthur.
King Arthur.
King Arthur. King Arthur. King Arthur. King Arthur.
But why is it so popular? Fate Zero and its sequels teach us a lot about how powerful Saber really is. But how does a revered king become a servant in the first place? There's so much people don't know about the King of Knights' tragic life, leading her to an ending most don't even know exists. So grab a drink and some snacks, because this is the tale of the King of Knights. Avalon is a world within a world, hidden in the reverse side of reality. Sprawling fields of emerald green stretch as far as the eye can see, under the eternal embrace of a vivid sky. People often confuse it with paradise, but that's not quite true. What we imagine to be paradise is actually just a pale imitation of Avalon. It's a world teeming with mesmerizing and mysterious life, the remnants of fairies who sought refuge when they left our realm. But don't let Avalon's beauty deceive you. For ordinary mortals, the density of magic is so potent that it could make most explode. And yet, a young mage stands unharmed thanks to his unique lineage. But this isn't just a mage, he's also an incubus, a magical being that can weather the storm of Avalon's power. His name is Merlin, and he's currently on the run, trying to escape something, or rather, someone. In Fate, Merlin is a bit of a playboy. He even had something going on with Vivienne, the Lady of the Lake, but he isn't the kind of mage to be tied down by one woman, and thus finds himself fleeing from her relentless pursuit. Just like Gilgamesh, Merlin also has clairvoyance, but it's not the exact same ability, and it unfolds in ways that might seem puzzling at first glance. This isn't like a crystal ball predicting the future. Instead, it's like he can see the world's grand tapestry as it is right now. From there, he calculates the threads of time and weaves together the outcomes of events. Think of it as a grand puzzle where he can see how each piece fits, but it's still up to him to put them into place. As luck would have it, Merlin's timing couldn't be worse. In the midst of his flower-strewn sanctuary, the kingdom of Camelot is grappling with upheaval. A certain knight threatens the very essence of justice that Camelot embodies. And with his clairvoyance, Merlin watches the destiny of a certain person unfold, yet he remains a passive observer, a mere spectator to the tragedy befalling Camelot. But here's the thing, as useful as Merlin's clairvoyance is, it also has a downside. Merlin sees people as paintings with their lives brushed across the canvas of time, and because of this very reason, he feels like an outsider that's distant from society. In fact, at times, he's even contemplated taking his own life. But a certain duty holds him back, a duty to watch over a certain person until the very end. Merlin's always found humans to be captivating. He's aware that one day humanity will no longer exist, but he still invests himself in mankind's journey, raising kings to carve a brighter destiny. And as he travels through Avalon, a tragic tale is unfolding, leading to the downfall of a certain king. But here's the twist. Merlin might seem like a friendly mage, but he's more like a chess player moving pieces on a board. He's on humanity's side, but his motives run deeper. He's working for his own satisfaction, his own benefit. It's like he's crafting this beautiful story of mankind, but his own joy is what's really at the heart of it all. And as Merlin's journey through Avalon continues, he stumbles upon a mysterious stone gate, and it has an inscription that makes him pause. Only the sinless may pass. And just like that, without realizing it, he's fallen right into Vivienne's trap. Because despite the warning, Merlin steps forward, intrigued by the idea of being sinless. For someone who doesn't see the world in terms of good and evil, this invitation is like a puzzle meant just for him. And with a spell known as the Garden, Vivienne seals Merlin in a tower in Avalon for eternity. But wait, what does any of this have to do with the King of Knights? Well, to answer that, let's rewind the story to where it all began. Our story begins on a small island back in the late 4th century where a good chunk of Britain was under the Roman Empire's rule. That wasn't a bad thing. It brought safety and stability to the land. The island was a bustling place filled with busy markets, storytellers spinning tales, and children playing in the streets. People celebrated festivals, danced to tunes, and shared stories of legendary red and white dragons. But these stories weren't just myths. They had a deep connection to the kingdom's fate. A great king named Uther Pendragon ruled the lands. He was wise and just, but even he couldn't rule an entire kingdom alone. That's where Merlin comes in. King Uther had a deep bond with Merlin. They played chess, debated the stars, and would often sit silently, understanding each other without the need for words. And as we roll into the 5th century, things start to get a little bit rocky. The Roman control started fading away, and eventually they left Britain to fend for itself. As a consequence, the political and military scene within Britain spiraled into chaos. The nation transformed into a feudal land with various tribes and kings vying for supremacy, leaving Britain exposed to be invaded by the Saxons. In the north, a group called the Picts had risen as a formidable force which pushed the southern kings to look beyond their own conflicts and work together to defeat them. But this wasn't a perfect harmony because there was one king, Vortigern, who chose a path of dissonance. Now I say king because it depends on which version of the story you prefer. In the original lore, Vortigern is stated to be a noble, but that was later changed in the Garden of Avalon translations. Anyway, Vortigern shattered agreements, aiming to unite Britain under the mantle of the White Dragon, a symbol of chaos. Allying with the Saxons, he plunged the nation into disarray. Speaking of dragons, let's talk about them for a second. The counter to the White Dragon of Chaos is the Red Dragon, or the Welsh Dragon, which symbolized Roman-British pride. Vortigern built a castle atop the sleeping dragons, but eventually woke them to fight once more, and the Red Dragon emerged victorious, marking the Britain's triumph over the Saxons. These dragons possess incredible magical cores, rendering them resistant to most magecraft, and drinking a dragon's blood can bestow this resistance upon ordinary humans. Now, these dragons were more prominent during the Age of the Gods, which I mentioned in my Gilgamesh lore. As this age faded, dragons vanished to the reverse side of existence, aka Avalon. Well, all except one. Albion. This pure-blooded dragon refused to leave, missing its chance to escape to the reverse side, but eventually it changed its mind and attempted to force its way into the reverse side by literally digging down. As you can imagine, this didn't really work out, and Albion perished midway, and its remains turned into a spiritual tomb. So why is this important? Well, the red and white dragons are not actually independent entities, but two sides of Albion. This tale intertwines with the Vortigern story because he becomes the White Dragon after his tribe drinks Albion's blood. And now back to the show. With such formidable power at Vortigern's command, the entirety of Britain faced an uncertain future. The balance of power was threatened, making Vortigern's moves not only politically dangerous, but also potentially catastrophic for the very fate of the island. King Uther desperately tried to fight back in an effort to preserve Britain's dignity, but nobody could match the strength of Vortigern's White Dragon. Or could they? Because Merlin's clairvoyance revealed a different path. Recognizing the looming threat, Uther and Merlin devised a strategy. The kingdom needed a ruler, someone so powerful that they could counteract Vortigern and his White Dragon. But Uther already had a child, Morgan Le Fay, and unfortunately, Morgan was a girl and thus would never be able to replace Uther as king. But this wasn't just about finding a replacement for Uther. This was about creating a beacon of hope for all of Britain. So what was their plan? Uther would have another child, but this wouldn't be any ordinary heir. With Merlin's magic, this child would embody the essence of the Red Dragon, a force capable of countering the White Dragon's power. But to do this, they needed the right woman, one of noble lineage that was compatible with Uther. The woman chosen was Lady Igraine, but she wasn't just any noble woman. She was beautiful, kind-hearted, brave, and intelligent. In the castle, she'd often help with the wounded, offering them care and comfort. She loved gardens and even had a special rose named after her, the Igraine Rose, which was said to bloom only under moonlight. Quite frankly, she was the perfect candidate. But you can probably see where I'm going with this. There was a problem. Lady Igraine was already married to Gorloy, the Duke of Cornwall and one of King Uther's loyal allies. It should be fairly obvious, I hope, that trying to have a child with a woman who was married to a political ally probably wouldn't go well. Well, fortunately, Merlin wasn't one to give up so easily. Using his magic, Merlin made King Uther look exactly like Gorloy. This way, Uther could be with Igraine without anyone knowing, and they soon had a baby, the very child that would then go on to become the legendary King Arthur. But there was a slight hiccup. Though the child was named Arthur, she was actually Artoria, and in a time where it wasn't possible for a woman to rule, she was instead given to an older knight named Sir Ector to be looked after, and the situation only seemed to go from bad to worse. Vortigern's alliance with the Saxons soon devastated the once mighty fortress of Londinium, basically London. Even Uther, one of Britain's most powerful kings, found himself outmatched against the relentless tide of chaos. The great king fought until the bitter end, hoping that his successor would rise to save Britain in his place. But instead, his death marked the descent into the dark ages of Britain. With the Saxons now having extended their control over Britain, the country was left in a state of constant warfare, leaving the soil ravaged and infertile, unable to bear any crops. But in the midst of this darkness, there was a beacon of hope. Merlin's prophetic words echoed across the lands, foretelling the rise of a new king, an incarnation of the Red Dragon. And that brings us to the heart of a quiet village, where we find ourselves in Artoria's youth. Raised under the watchful eye of Sir Ector, she shared her days with him and his son, Sir Kay. The key thing to note here is that she was raised as a boy, with only a few knowing that she was really a girl. Every morning, Artoria would wake up and watch the sunrise from her room, feeling its warmth and promise. Artoria served as Kay's squire. She took care of the horses, and Sir Ector would teach her sword fighting and the ways of the knight, bravery, honor, and skill. As for Sir Kay, he also knew that Artoria was actually a girl, but his job was to guide her and treat her as his younger brother. Artoria always thought that Kay was her real brother, but one day she found out that the two were not related by blood. But for Artoria, this didn't really change anything, because to her, he would always be her annoying big brother. The two had playful fights, which Artoria often won, raced each other, and had several arguments, which Kay always won. They were like real siblings. Children in the village idolized Kay. They'd often run behind him, mimicking his moves, dreaming of becoming valiant knights themselves one day. And Kay would often entertain them by telling them tales of fighting 10 dragons or saving a princess from a tower guarded by a sleeping giant. During one of their playful days, Artoria fell ill, and Kay was the only one there to care for her, where he said, "It would be troublesome for me if you died now." He promised to do whatever she asked, showing how much he truly loved his sister. While these days seemed filled with simple joys, every legend has its shadows, and little did Artoria know her life was about to change forever. As dawn paints the sky with hues of pink and gold, Artoria is already awake, having spent the night watching over a newborn foal in the village stables. Waking up, Artoria finds herself pleasantly surprised. A soft blanket has been draped over her as she slept, which she suspected was thanks to her older brother. She starts her day as normal by tending to the horses and bragging to Ector's horse about her fencing progress. Sir Ector might not be a legendary knight, but Artoria knows his strength. She cherishes every moment she can match his prowess, but lately Artoria notes he's been acting strange. It's like there's something he's not telling her. As the days roll by, their routine continues, training, bonding, growing. But today, something's different. It's Artoria's 15th birthday, or 14th or 16th depending on which translation you prefer, and there's a sense of finality in the air. Over lunch, Ector makes an unusual request. Kay needs his lance delivered to the fair in town, and Artoria agrees to help, as she always does. As they chat, she senses Ector's worries. It's clear something's bothering him, but he won't tell her what. As Artoria travels into town, she notices something is different. Harvest season should be lively, but there's an eerie quietness. Forests that used to provide hunters with bounty are now dangerous and off limits, claimed by foreign tribes. But the arrival of Merlin stirs excitement among the townsfolk because he had come to anoint the successor to the throne. Artoria's journey led her to this humble village where knights from all corners of the realm had gathered. A trial not of brute force, but of virtue awaited them. There was a certain stone in the city, a stone which held a magical sword. Now this golden sword isn't the one you're thinking of, it's actually called Caliburn. You see, Merlin had set a test. Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone is rightwise king of all England. The legendary sword Caliburn rested within the stone, waiting for the worthy one to draw it forth and claim the title of king. Many tried, including brave knights and even Sir Kay, but they all failed. Instead, they decided to joust with one another as another way to elect the next king. And then we see Artoria approach the stone. She thinks back to her lessons, her dreams, and the future of Britain. She wondered why she, of all people, a girl disguised as a boy, was chosen for this. She dreamt about a normal life, shopping in the market or laughing with friends. But shaking away her doubts, she gripped the sword's handle. A strange sensation filled the air. Birds went silent, winds paused, and it felt like even the earth was holding its breath. Was this the moment Britain had been waiting for? The turning point of its fate. The sun seemed to shine brighter, casting a golden hue upon the magical sword. As Artoria grasps Caliburn's hilt, she can't help but feel something's off. It's light. Really light. The sword that was once an unyielding presence in the stone was yielding effortlessly to her touch. But as she braces herself to draw it forth, Merlin finally makes his appearance, bringing with him a new prophecy, one that weaves a tragic tapestry of her future. He paints a vivid picture, a life where she loses her humanity, where she's hated by her people and ultimately meets a horrendous death. Merlin wasn't telling Artoria that this was what might happen to her if she pulled out Caliburn. He was showing her what would happen. But that's the thing. Merlin wants Artoria to become king. So why is he showing her all of this? Maybe it's simply about giving her the power to choose her own fate. Get it? Fate? Because you might think that in typical anime fashion, Artoria doesn't care about Merlin's words and pulls the sword out anyway. But she hesitates. Not because she's worried about her tragic future, but because she wonders if there's someone more suited to be king. Someone who truly deserves the throne. But unfortunately for Artoria, no such person exists, leaving the burden on the shoulders of a 15-year-old girl. As Merlin was showing Artoria her tragic future, she saw something else. There were glimpses of joy, of smiles, and these became her motivation to finally pull forth the sword of selection. And that's when we see wicked satisfaction on Merlin's face. He savors the knowledge of the suffering Artoria will endure during her campaign. It isn't out of cruelty or even ill will. He simply views it as a masterpiece in the making. He relishes in her agony, finding his own gratification in her suffering. Artoria knew that drawing this sword meant she would be forced to live a life where she'd be hated by thousands and would die a horrendous death, but she didn't care. This was the moment she had prepared for. And with that, she pulls out Caliburn, becoming the new ruler of Britain. Pulling out Caliburn meant that Artoria's body stopped aging, leaving her stuck in the body of a 15-year-old girl. But even so, she still had to continue hiding her gender. Let's take a quick break and focus on Sir Kay. We see him reflecting on Artoria's journey from the tender age of 5. In his eyes, he always envisioned her maturing into a striking woman, which is an image that amuses him. But he reminds himself to treat her as a little brother, a role he's taken up since her early days. From her very conception, Artoria's humanity melded with the essence of the Red Dragon, resulting in a powerful manner that exceeded human limitations. It was almost divine, and some believe that it was entirely divine, with many knights believing Artoria seemed more god than mortal. And yet, despite these extraordinary beginnings, Kay remarked how normal Artoria was. Despite her training and the grand destiny looming over her, she effortlessly blended into daily life. Her fellow knights admired her resilience, believing her to have an unyielding heart, but only Kay and Ector knew about the delicate nature beneath her seemingly unbreakable exterior. For all her strength, Artoria wasn't resistant to hurt or discouragement. She merely refused to let them affect her duties, as was the role of a king. And that's when Kay unveils a hidden truth. As he understands it, the entire trial was crafted for Artoria and Artoria alone. But then that begs the question, what was even the point of the trial? One argument is that the people needed to see for themselves that someone had fulfilled the prophecy to become Britain's ruler. But another darker argument is that Merlin orchestrated it in a way that would render Artoria unable to run away from her duties, to see things through to the very end. Artoria ruled England as King Arthur, but she didn't mind that. She was always raised and treated as a boy, so she barely considered herself a woman in the first place. But if that was true, then why did she always dream of living a simple life as a girl in the city? Her journey begins alongside Cersei and Merlin. To prevent being noticed by Vortigern, she starts small, liberating only a single tribe. But slowly and steadily, she establishes a base and rallies knights for the Round Table, preparing to confront the Saxons. Naturally, Serkay was disappointed that he wasn't able to pull out the sword, but even more than that, he was still proud of his little sister and became the first to pledge his allegiance to her. And alongside Merlin, they became the first 3 members of the Knights of the Round Table. Speaking of the Round Table, let's talk about the 13 members. The Round Table literally takes the form of a circular table, but it actually originated as a mystic code symbolizing the bonds between the 13 knights. But at this point, not all 13 seats are taken. We already know about Artoria, Kay and Merlin, but there was also Sir Bedivere. He was the only one that Artoria allowed herself to be vulnerable with. She told him that she often felt inadequate and that she often sympathized with the invaders. After all, even her enemies were only doing what they had to do so they could create a promising future for their people. But despite being so close to her, he never once realized that his beloved King Arthur was actually a woman. And then we have Sir Agravain, who was actually a spy placed by Morgan, his mother. Agravain understood his mother's wishes. He wanted nothing more than for Britain's king to be someone strong and just, someone who could lead them to a new future. And he realized that there was none better to lead his country than King Arthur, and so he swears his loyalty to her, becoming her second in command, which, as you can imagine, only infuriated Morgan that much more. Sir Gawain was Artoria's unwavering right hand. He didn't always understand the weight on his king's shoulders, but was incredibly loyal to her regardless. Sir Tristan is known as the Child of Sorrow and is stated to be so charming that even fairies become flustered in his presence. He excels at archery, but his weapon isn't just a regular bow. His noble phantasm, Failnaught, is a harp whose strings unleash sonic waves instead of traditional arrows. We also have Percival, Gareth, Gaheris, Palamedes and Galahad, but you know, who cares? Artoria's rule wasn't without its challenges. Her elder sister Morgan harbored resentment for her, and unlike Artoria, who was prophesied and celebrated, Morgan felt sidelined and grew envious. And from the shadows, she plotted, aiming to undo Artoria's reign. But what exactly pushed Morgan to the edge? Did she only desire the throne, or was there something more sinister at play? Artoria's reign was defined by action. She fought the Saxons in 11 major battles, always leading from the forefront. Her magnetic presence united the fragmented lords, and under her vision, Camelot transformed into a symbol of prosperity and unity. We see her reintroduce cataphracts, a heavily armored cavalry designed to shatter enemy lines. And while this is a brilliant strategy from a military point of view, for Artoria it's a bitter realization given her fondness for horses. After all, these innocent and loyal creatures were being made to sacrifice their lives in battles they couldn't even understand. But that's just the duty of a king. And these victories soon elevate King Arthur's reputation, with Britain finally viewing her, or rather him, as their long-awaited monarch. But as powerful as Artoria was, Merlin realized that Caliban alone would not be enough to defeat Vortigern, so led Artoria to obtain another weapon. That's right. Actually, it's not the weapon you're thinking of. It was a holy lance called Rhongomyniad, but it wasn't actually a weapon. It essentially acted as a cosmic pillar holding the realms apart, but in Artoria's hands, it did so much more. Artoria's reign came with its challenges, and one such incident involved a trap set by Morgan during a training session, which resulted in her trusted sword Caliban breaking. Now I hope you know by now that Caliban wasn't just a sword. It was the reason Artoria didn't age, the reason she had won so many battles, and the reason she was the ruler of Britain. So without it, she felt lost. So who better to make her feel better than her older brother? I'm sure everyone has felt that in the darkest moments, even the smallest gestures can shine bright. Just like he always did in their childhood, Serkay made a wooden carving of a bird capturing a salmon for his little sister. It was a simple gesture, but it gave Artoria a glimmer of hope. But unfortunately, sentiment alone isn't enough to protect a nation. So Artoria journeyed to find a new purpose, to find an answer. This brings us to one of the more popular stories from Arthur's legend. It was on Artoria's travels that she met Vivian, the Lady of the Lake. Vivian was a fairy, an extension of the planet's will, entrusted to guard a powerful sword, a divine weapon forged from the very dreams and hopes of humanity. 14,000 years ago, the Earth was invaded by a ship called the Harvester Star. On this ship were 3 entities called Velba 01, Velba 02, and Velba 03. Velba 2 was called the White Titan, who went on to destroy most of mankind's early civilizations. Now here's where I'm gonna blow your mind. For those of you who haven't watched my Gilgamesh video, I mentioned that the Earth was invaded by a being called Safar, who killed many of the gods and was eventually defeated. Well, Safar was in fact this very same white titan, and she was defeated by a human that wielded a powerful sword that was created by 6 great fairies in Avalon, Excalibur. In the video, I said Gilgamesh has every noble phantasm in his treasury, but this isn't entirely true. Excalibur is a divine construct and is one of the few weapons even the King of Heroes doesn't possess. It's the strongest of the holy swords, equaled only by the demonic sword Gram. While there are other noble phantasms crafted with better skill, Excalibur is an illusion far superior to them. It's so perfect that you can't even use the word beautiful to describe it, because that will dirty it. It's considered to be one of the greatest noble phantasms. Its speed, attack, and reach far surpass all other noble phantasms, with only Ea surpassing it in terms of pure power. I'll talk more about Excalibur and Artoria's other noble phantasms in the sequel to this video. Excalibur came with a magical scabbard, Avalon, which is different to the place. And with these 2 items, Artoria not only gained immense power, but also immortality. With Excalibur, she had a weapon unlike any other, and with Avalon, she would never die, as time would now stand still for her. While Artoria wielded Excalibur with unmatched skill, it's worth noting that it also had a twin, Excalibur Galatine, a blade that drew power from the very sun, and Artoria entrusted it to Sir Gawain, knowing he'd step up if she ever fell. With the might of Excalibur, the time defiance of Avalon, and the power of Rhongomyniad, Artoria seemed invincible. But then why did such a powerful king end up volunteering as a servant? The Knights of the Round Table believed themselves to be equal to one another. That was supposed to be the rule. But even so, they all still considered Artoria as their superior because the unity of the Round Table hinged on her lead the Citadel's defences and reached the throne room, where Vortigern stood alone, heavily armoured and cloaked in shadows. He declared to them his twisted dream of making Britain a paradise free from humans, even if it meant plunging the land into hell. Artoria fought Vortigern alone with every ounce of her being. She resisted his overwhelming force and held her ground for hours, but Vortigern was pushing back, and from the depths of shadow and despair, an unimaginable beast emerged as Vortigern transformed into a colossal white dragon, decimating Artoria's forces, with Gawain being the only survivor. Gawain contemplated retreat, but Artoria denied, calling for his help. Against his better judgment, the loyal knight fought at his king's side. With Vortigern's sinister laugh echoing, Artoria and Gawain, bounded by duty, launched a final desperate assault and managed to pin Vortigern to the ground by impaling their holy swords into his hands. Artoria then drew Rhongomyniad and harnessed its immense power to pierce Vortigern's heart, ending his tyranny. As the now human Vortigern disintegrated into nothingness, he crawled forward, inch by inch, revealing a haunting prophecy. He stated that Artoria, with the essence of the Red Dragon, is incompatible with Britain's trajectory into the Age of Man. And with that, he ripped the spear out of his own chest, laughing until his final breath, leaving Artoria to wonder if she would find herself at odds with the very land she swore to protect. With the stronghold reclaimed, Artoria initiates the construction of Camelot, and we see Artoria in her newly constructed office inside of her castle, which is a marvel of architecture. She notes that it's far too lavish and grand for her liking, but Merlin states that a king should live lavishly. He clarifies that the castle wasn't funded by taxing the citizens. Instead, it was constructed by fairies disguised as humans. Now, this is the first time I've really mentioned fairies, but they actually play a pretty important role in this story, which I'll get to later on. In this era, most fairies have departed to the reverse side, but can still access the realm through a mystical portal. There are also demonic beasts and giants roaming the lands, but they don't have access to this portal and are unable to reach the reverse side. Now back to Artoria. Her focus is currently on thwarting the Saxons. Within her circle of knights, Artoria relies on Sir Agravain's judgment quite a lot. Despite being Morgan's son, Agravain remains loyal because he recognizes the king's potential. You wouldn't often see him at the front lines, but when you did, he would always remain unscathed, earning him the nickname Agravain the Woundless. But even with Vortigern gone, Britain wasn't at peace. The skies withheld rain, crops withered, and hunger gnawed at every heart. The people, desperate and in despair, turned their frustrations towards their young king. In one particularly cold winter, a tearful village elder pleaded with Artoria to spare his village, but with a heavy heart, she ordered its dismantling to ensure more people across the kingdom could survive. And every stone removed from her home echoed the cries of families, a sound that haunted Artoria to the very end. But Artoria pressed on. She led from the front, fighting without rest, earning both awe and fear. Many knights began to see her not as human, but as an unyielding machine. While she was undoubtedly an incredible knight, there was an area in which she lacked. Having trained as a knight her whole life, she hadn't lived the daily life of those she ruled, and many felt she couldn't understand the common man. And this distance would only keep growing, but no one could deny her devotion. For Artoria, Britain's future wasn't just in winning battles or conquering lands, but it was also in ploughing fields, daily livelihoods, and children's laughter. While her knights rejoiced in their victories, Artoria always looked ahead, thinking of ways to better the kingdom. Maybe that's why she never saw happiness. As nights turned to days and battles came and went, Merlin often found himself gazing upon the tireless Artoria from the shadowed hallways of Camelot. Each decision she made, each burden she bore, weighed not just on her, but on his conscience too. She had evolved into a monarch who'd sacrifice anything, even her own happiness, for Britain, and he knew this selflessness would ultimately drive her to a tragic end. For its continued stability, it was important for Britain to have both a king and a queen, so Artoria entered into a marriage with Guinevere. Naturally, with both being women, the marriage was more about political stability than love. It's important to note that most of the Round Table still believed Artoria to be a male, but she confided in Guinevere about her true gender. I mean, after all, it would be a bit weird if your wife thought you were a man if you were actually a woman. You see, Guinevere had actually pursued Arthur for decades, longing for the king's affection with great admiration and respect. So you can imagine this came as quite a shock. Her dream of becoming Arthur's queen was shattered in an instant. But Guinevere still understood the importance of this marriage for the kingdom and agreed to keep it a secret. But their marriage was not what it seemed. Although they appeared as a blessed couple, their happiness was far from genuine. Artoria always felt guilty about Guinevere's sacrifice, knowing that her wife was giving up her own happiness for the sake of the kingdom. But in the same way, Guinevere also believed that Artoria was the one making a significant sacrifice, with both women feeling like they were missing out on what Guinevere referred to as a woman's happiness. But despite the lack of romance, Artoria and Guinevere still shared a genuine camaraderie. Artoria, being a girl, couldn't provide an heir to the nation, but Merlin used his magic to temporarily grant Artoria the means to produce an heir. But this magic became a double-edged sword when the conniving Morgan saw an opportunity. She tricked Merlin and stole Artoria's sperm, using it to impregnate herself. I know, just stay with me, okay? Morgan gave birth to Mordred, a girl who was the spitting image of Artoria. It's worth noting that Mordred was actually unaware of her true lineage and grew up admiring Artoria's rule. But when Morgan, hungry for power, revealed to her daughter that she was actually the child of King Artoria, Mordred confronted Artoria, demanding recognition. But Artoria saw Mordred's impetuous nature and denied her, causing the admiration Mordred had for Artoria to turn into a burning rage. You see, Artoria didn't outright reject Mordred. She genuinely considered her request. She simply realized that it wouldn't be best for her kingdom because Mordred was not fit to rule. Rejected by Artoria and fueled by Morgan's ambitions, Mordred became a beacon for those who were dissatisfied with Artoria's reign. Her charisma and the promise of a different Britain gained her a lot of support, setting the stage for an eventual confrontation. Around the same time as the marriage, someone else joined the Round Table, one who was far more powerful than any other knight. His name was, of course, Lancelot. While he was immensely skilled, he brought even more value to the Round Table through continental trade, because he was actually the feudal lord of a foreign land in France. During this period, with Sir Lancelot at the table, the knights achieved their most famous feats, and over the next decade, Artoria mediates among Britain's various lords while quelling their feuds with the Saxons. But while they achieved great success with Lancelot's arrival, it would eventually change the dynamics of the Round Table forever. Kay voiced his opinion and said that many of those following Arthur are not entirely genuine. He said their loyalty wasn't because of sincere belief, but because of Arthur's success. In reality, they saw her as a child, a strange and unnatural being who hadn't aged since the day she drew Caliburn. Artoria's people, while serving her, secretly scorned her, yearning for a chance to exploit any instability. They only accepted her when things were going well. So in their eyes, Artoria remained the ideal king as long as her rule remained unblemished. However, as problems began to rise, their adorations transformed into blame. The same followers who once pledged allegiance to King Arthur now joined Mordred's army without a second thought. This dire situation leaves Kay to seek advice from Merlin on their next move. Kay contemplates leaving everything behind and starting a new life somewhere else, but he can't abandon his sister. And the thing is, Merlin also can't. Kay mourns how Artoria was denied the very life she sought to protect. He remembers her days of training under Ector, where she would tend to the horses or guard the village. But now, every facet of Artoria's life was devoted to being a king. And that's just not how anyone should live. Prior to Artoria's reign, people blamed their hardships on Vortigern and the invading Saxons. So what do you think happened when the great king finally defeated Vortigern, but the people's hardships remained? Well, they put all of their blame on their king, even blaming her for the soil being barren. But being the amazing king that she was, she accepted responsibility for it. But why was Britain's soil barren in the first place? Before, they had constant warfare to blame, but now there were much fewer battles, and the soil should have been more fertile. So what was the problem? According to Merlin, the issue isn't the land's poor harvest, rather it's the fading connection to Rangominiad's light. Excalibur is not a weapon made to fight enemies, it's a sword forged by the planet to safeguard itself. But Rangominiad is different. It is designed to anchor reality to the planet. We know Artoria wields two remarkable divine constructs that were not originally intended for her. The issue here is that the people of Britain can't perceive its light, so Artoria considers returning it. But it isn't that simple. The Lady of the Lake entrusted Artoria with Excalibur, Avalon and Rangominiad for a purpose, even if we might not know what that purpose is yet. We know that today Britain is a pretty small island, but it actually held a lot of importance. In Artoria's time, it stood as one of the last sanctuaries of Arcana, where there was still some remnants from the Age of the Gods. And this is because its isolation shields it from the rest of the world. But that's not necessarily a good thing. The fact that it's a sanctuary of Arcana means that if there were to be a mage with malicious intent, they would be able to upend reality just by taking control of Britain. So Artoria's protection of Britain actually safeguards the entire planet. Had Vortigern prevailed, it could have spelt the end of the earth as we know it. Now by this point, Artoria's public image is already tarnished. Both her citizens and her fellow knights strive for a brighter future, and the people's hopes rest on Artoria's shoulders. Her suffering and struggles are seen as paving the path to Britain's prosperity. Artoria confidently embraces this tragic role, and this is when Merlin realizes he might have pushed her too far. He acknowledges pride in their power. And that's not to say that's a bad thing, because the populace often emulates such kings as role models. Artoria also had this charisma, but her rule isn't driven by self-interest. She's proud that as king, she's able to serve her people rather than inspire them. And while Britain certainly prospered under the great King Arthur, Artoria knew that Camelot's prosperity couldn't last forever. Merlin informed her about the Age of Gods declining, which was a big issue considering Britain's fertility depended on the flourishing manna provided by the Age of Gods. Britain was invaded again by Rome, who wanted a piece of its prosperity. Artoria returned to the battlefield but noted that this battle was different. Unlike with Vortigern, these battles were against humans who had no choice but to battle. They needed resources for survival. And as the battle raged on, Artoria had no choice but to dismantle villages, depriving her people of their homes and resources so that they could be used in war, which brought shame to her and her knights. But we already know Artoria wasn't cruel. She still gave the people who lost their homes a safe place to migrate to, but her people resented her for it, thinking of her as an inhuman warlord who abandoned her people, with some people even starting rebellions against her. But was she really the heartless ruler everyone painted her to be? Sir Tristan definitely thought so. He claimed King Arthur did not understand the human heart, and with these words, He was the first knight to depart from the Round Table, and the saddest part, nobody questioned his decision. Following Tristan's departure, many other esteemed knights retired from Artoria's army, but instead of labeling them as traitors, she granted them the ability to govern their own lands. Now you might think this was really nice of her, but there was actually some strategy to this because it allowed her to use those territories as decoys in her next campaign. As you can imagine, as effective as this was, it didn't run well with her knights, which only made them think of her as even more inhuman. Artoria continued to fight through 12 grueling battles against foreign tribes. She single-handedly killed 40 enemies, with the invaders swearing an oath to never set foot in Britain again. Standing atop a small hill with Excalibur thrust into the ground, Artoria looked upon her knights, her face showing no joy despite her victory. Instead, she simply shared her glory with her knights, but in the back of her mind, an issue still lingered. While they had managed to defeat the invaders, there was still a bigger problem. Britain's mana was still depleting. To resolve this, she confided in Merlin, who told her about a miracle that was on par with Britain's former arcana, the Holy Grail. If Artoria could obtain the legendary Holy Grail, she could restore prosperity to her dying lands. And so the Knights of the Round Table embarked on separate journeys to find the Grail, with nearly all of them returning in failure. And sadly, Percival even perished in the process. But Lancelot's son Galahad was the only one to actually find it. But for a reason Artoria doesn't know, he sent the Grail back to heaven, ascending alongside it. As Artoria searched for solutions and faced betrayals, she faced an even more haunting question. What would she be willing to trade for the future of Britain? One of the most popular tales from the legend of King Arthur is the story of the affair between Guinevere and Arthur's most powerful knight, Lancelot. But how was this affair exposed? Let's take a step back to Lancelot's first experience with Arthur from across the sea. Having heard of the Sword of Selection, he thought that nobody but himself could be such a valiant knight. He set sail to Britain to prove his superiority, only to spot Artoria in battle from afar. As someone who valued strength, he laughed when he saw a young boy on the battlefield, but he began to realize that the essence of a knight doesn't come from the body, but from the spirit. Impressed by Artoria's resolve, Lancelot joined her in the fight and was invited to Camelot to speak with her and soon joined the Round Table, never knowing about Artoria's actual gender. While many of the knights eventually began to see Artoria as inhuman, Lancelot disagreed with that notion. Perhaps this was because he was an outsider, a knight from France with different values. While Britain valued its nation, Lancelot valued individuals. Lancelot yearned to prevent Artoria's suffering, a feeling shared by Guinevere, and it was this mutually shared feeling that brought them together in the first place. But Lancelot was still too loyal to his king to ever betray Artoria's trust. That is until Guinevere tells Lancelot the truth about their king. But when Lancelot finds out that Arthur was actually Artoria, his mind went to something else. He realized that Guinevere must be lonely, and that made him resent Britain for pushing this burden upon her. This anger played a role in his decision to betray Artoria in favor of being with the queen. Agravain was actually one of the first knights to learn of Artoria's secret, and that made him question Guinevere's loyalty. Why was she married to a girl? Eventually, Agravain's doubts are proven right when he exposes the affair and imprisons Guinevere for treason. Lancelot couldn't stand by as Agravain insulted the queen and her worthiness, causing him to lash out in a fit of rage. He fought and killed countless knights and eventually escaped to France with Guinevere by his side. Naturally, from this point on, everyone labelled him as a traitor, but that didn't upset him. In fact, it made him feel relieved. Lancelot genuinely cared for his king and he felt guilty for his betrayal, so he hoped that seeing his betrayal, Artoria would reconsider her ideals and walk away from the path he knew would lead her to a tragic end. But instead, Artoria simply forgave Lancelot, and this shattered him. At first, he hoped that Artoria was only forgiving him for the sake of the country so that he would return to the table, but no, Lancelot could tell that this forgiveness was genuine. Artoria truly wished for their happiness, even at the expense of her own. Yet again, Artoria was showing a smile for others, appreciating their happiness while never knowing it for herself. And that's when Lancelot begins to fear Artoria as a monster. one much worse than Vortigern. And it's a fear that we soon see evolve into something else in Fate Zero. This brings us to the 10th year of King Arthur's rule, where Merlin asks her about the meaning of chivalry. Artoria thought of this as somewhat random, but she described it as upholding morals, being a shield for the people, never showing fear in battle, and not taking up the sword for personal gain. Merlin counters that perhaps chivalry can vary from person to person, and maybe it was Lancelot's own chivalry towards Guinevere that led to their affair. Maybe this was his attempt at comforting Artoria about her wife's betrayal, but Artoria never harboured any bitterness in the first place. She felt sorry for Lancelot and Guinevere, understanding that their political situation forced them to suppress their feelings for each other. She mentioned that the Round Table has shrunk due to Lancelot's departure, with tragic consequences like Agravain, Gareth and Geras being slain, each loss echoing a mistake the King of Knights had made along the way. Unfortunately, Artoria couldn't dwell on these losses as she was forced to turn her attention to Rome, which had become a threat on par with the Saxons. Merlin looks at her confidence and radiance with sorrow, but he knows she won't ever back down from her oath as king. He tries to teach her that her rule is more important than its outcome, and even if she fails, she should take pride in what she's achieved. We know that Merlin is already aware of her impending death, and he realizes that she won't find peace until Britain truly prospers. Sadly, she doesn't understand this because she lacks pride in herself and her own happiness. Because in the end, whatever dreams the 15-year-old Artoria might have had died when she pulled the sword out of the stone. And Gawain. Now I'm sure you see the problem here. Mordred rallies all those dissatisfied with Artoria's reign and sparks a rebellion. At any other point in history, Artoria would have easily been able to suppress such an uprising, but the fact that she's in Rome provides Mordred with the perfect opportunity. We already know that Avalon, the object, not the place, grants Artoria immortality. It establishes a bounded field, temporarily placing Artoria's body in Avalon, the place, not the object, allowing her to endure even devastating attacks like Enuma Elish. Moreover, it possesses incredible healing capabilities. But why am I telling you all of this now? Well, that's because at some point she loses it. How? I don't know, it doesn't really say. All we know is that it was stolen and she doesn't have it when she returns from Rome. When the time comes for Artoria to board her ship, Merlin confesses that he won't be joining her. He tells her how he's angered Vivian and must flee to Avalon, which is what we saw at the start of this story. The two share a laugh over this and Artoria expresses her gratitude for his mentorship. She wonders if the feelings she has towards Merlin are love. But being king, she was never able to feel any of these emotions, so she can't say for sure. It's more of an expression of gratitude rather than genuine affection. But Merlin also states that he's fallen in love with her. But remember, Merlin's emotions aren't that of humans, so his love isn't what we would traditionally consider to be love either. It's kind of an ironic moment with two people who know nothing about love trying to convey it in their own unique ways. And so, Artoria sets sail with no idea what awaits her return. That brings us to the day of Camlann, a chapter that forever marks the annals of history. Artoria successfully signed a treaty with Rome with minimal casualties. However, on the return trip, she can't help but be nervous. You see, Rome isn't scared of Britain. They're scared of Artoria, and Artoria knows that their arrangement is only going to be useful as long as she lives. And as king, she needs to think about what will happen to her country after she's gone. As they draw closer to the harbour, the weight of losing Avalon was heavy on Artoria, because for the first time in her life, the invincible king was vulnerable. A distant fire comes into view. Mordred's rebellion has gained support from 7 clans and 8 lords, all waiting to bring Artoria down. For Artoria to even dock her ships, Sir Kay and Gawain must fight their way through her own men who are already tired from battles in Rome. Gawain, still nursing his injuries from his fight with Lancelot, meets his end in a duel with Mordred. Kay, on the other hand, remains stuck in the rear guard, never getting a chance to see Artoria. The Battle of Camlann is a grueling 7-day war of attrition between the two armies. Mordred had hoped to eliminate Artoria before it came to this, but her plan had failed and Britain was suffering for it. And that's when Artoria has a realization. She realizes that the rebels joined Mordred because they couldn't endure the famine. But what had caused this famine in the first place? Well, it was none other than Artoria herself. She looked upon the chaos, the famine and the despair, all consequences of her own decisions. She had kept promising them a brighter future even when they were already at their limit. Her relentless determination had blinded her to the suffering of her subjects, and this realization breaks her spirits, with Excalibur's light fading as she stands on a mountain of corpses at Camlann. The air grew tense as Artoria faced Mordred, their shared history a tangle of pride, ambition and regret. This wasn't just a battle of swords, but of legacies, of what could have been. It's at this moment she admits that Tristan was right about her not comprehending the human heart. Mordred, wielding her sword Clarent, declares the end of Artoria's country. Desperately, she asks why she wasn't acknowledged as her son or the heir to the throne, but Artoria doesn't answer. Instead, the two engage in a fierce battle, and Artoria uses Rongominiad to pierce and eviscerate the rebellious knight. But in return, Mordred's blade cracks Artoria's skull and gouges one of her eyes. As Mordred is dying, Artoria tells her that she never hated her. She just didn't believe Mordred was ready to be king. And with that, Mordred's life fades away. Seeing all the pain and suffering, Artoria's heart broke. She wanted to make a better world, but so many had suffered. She was the one destined for a tragic death, not her subjects or her knights. Wanting to change the tragic end of her story, Artoria was desperate to do anything, and thus the will of the planet reaches out to her, and Artoria makes a massive decision. She dedicates herself to serving the Counterforce, giving up her peace to be able to search for the Holy Grail again, hoping to turn back time and save Britain from this dark fate. But when Artoria's story ends, Saber's story begins. There are still 4 more parts to the legend of Artoria Pendragon, so if you want to see how this story ends, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the tragedy of Saber.